Hello and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share tonight. One of them takes us to Aichi Prefecture, Japan, to an abandoned textile factory that locals now call the Factory of Whispers. Once a thriving workplace during the post-war boom, it now stands in silence, swallowed by rust and ivy. At night, the windows glow faintly, though no power has run through the building for years. Passersby claim they can still hear the rhythmic sound of weaving machines echoing from inside, like ghostly hands continuing unfinished work. The story begins in 2003, when a young woman named Yuki took a night shift there. It was supposed to be quiet, uneventful, just her and the machines. But what she found instead was something no one could explain. After midnight, the air seemed to hum with unseen voices, and shadows began to move where no light should have reached. Something waited inside that factory, something that still whispers when the world sleeps. Yuki was 27 when she started her first night shift at the old textile factory in Aichi Prefecture. She had just moved back from Nagoya after losing her office job and needed whatever work she could find. The factory wasn't glamorous, but the pay was steady, and the manager had promised her quiet nights, nothing more than checking the weaving lines and logging the machine data. It sounded simple enough, but the moment she saw the building, something inside her hesitated. The structure stood at the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown fields and rusted fences. Its tall windows were clouded with dust, and the main gate creaked like it hadn't been opened in years. A faint smell of oil and something older, maybe burnt fabric or smoke, hung in the air. Even from the outside, the place felt heavy, like it carried memories that refused to fade. Inside, the lights flickered with a yellow tint. The hallways stretched long and narrow, lined with empty lockers and forgotten equipment. Old safety posters curled at the edges, and every step Yuki took echoed in the emptiness. There were only a handful of workers assigned to the night shift, a guard at the entrance, 2 technicians on rotation, and Yuki. Most of the factory had been shut down since the late 90s, but a few weaving machines were still used for small batch orders. Her job was to make sure they didn't overheat, to report any irregular noise, and to keep the production logs up to date. At first, she told herself the silence was peaceful. She liked the stillness, the way her thoughts filled the air. But as the hours passed, that quiet became something else. The old machines seemed to breathe. The pipes rattled in the walls. Every so often, a faint creak came from the weaving floor, as if someone had stepped lightly across the boards. Yuki brushed it off. Buildings this old had their own language. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She found herself glancing toward the far end of the floor, where the older looms sat covered in sheets. Their outlines looked almost human in the dim light-bent, patient figures waiting for work that would never come. Once, she thought she saw one of the sheets move, a slow ripple as though stirred by breath. But when she turned her flashlight toward it, there was nothing, just the fabric settling back into place. During her break, Yuki sat near the vending machine by the staff office. The fluorescent lights buzzed above her, and the air smelled faintly metallic. The night guard, an elderly man named Tanaka, shuffled past and nodded without a word. He'd worked there for decades. His expression was calm, almost too calm, like someone who had learned not to notice certain things. "Quiet night," Yuki said softly. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded again. "It's always quiet," he replied. But his tone carried something that made her uneasy, as if quiet wasn't necessarily good. When midnight came, The power grid flickered. For a second, everything went dark. Then the machines started humming again, though she hadn't turned them on. She froze, staring across the weaving floor. The red indicator lights glowed faintly, one by one, as though the looms were waking up from a long sleep. The rhythm of their motion echoed through the hall, soft, steady, mechanical. She took her flashlight and started down the aisle, her footsteps careful and slow. The beam of light cut through the haze of dust. She could hear something under the sound of the machines, a faint, layered murmur, almost like whispers. It faded when she stopped walking, then returned when she moved again. Her skin prickled, and her breath came shallow. It was supposed to be just another shift, another quiet night. But in that moment, standing among the empty looms, Yuki realized something else was working alongside her. Something that had never left the factory. The next night, Yuki arrived early, hoping to shake off the unease that had settled in her chest. She told herself it was exhaustion, maybe the fluorescent lighting or the hum of old machinery playing tricks on her mind. Still, when she stepped through the factory gates, that same heaviness pressed down on her shoulders. The building loomed against the dark sky, its roof swallowed by fog. Even the crickets outside seemed hesitant to make a sound. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been. Her breath formed faint clouds when she exhaled. The day shift supervisor, a quiet man named Okada, handed her the nightly checklist. He avoided eye contact as he did, mumbling something about the circuit breakers acting up again. When she mentioned that one of the weaving lines had started on its own the night before, he looked up sharply. His face went pale, and for a moment, he didn't speak. Then, forcing a strained smile, he said, "Old machines do that. Static feedback. Don't worry about it." But his voice trembled slightly, and Yuki noticed how quickly he walked away after that. The first few hours passed uneventfully. The factory's clock ticked past 10, then 11. The machines sat silent in the gloom, their outlines lit by the faint glow of her flashlight. Yuki moved between them, checking the readouts, logging numbers that barely changed. It was repetitive, mind-numbing work, yet her nerves wouldn't settle. Every now and then, she thought she heard something just beyond the edge of hearing. A faint shuffle, a soft sigh, the whisper of fabric brushing against fabric. At 11:30, she went to the staff office to warm her hands by the small electric heater. Tanaka, the night guard, was there again, sitting at his desk with his back straight and his eyes half closed. He didn't look at her as she entered. The faint blue glow of his radio illuminated his face. "Tanaka-san," she began, her voice low, "did you ever hear things here when it's quiet?" His eyelids lifted, and for a moment she thought he might laugh. Instead, he stared at her with an expression that was hard to read, not surprise, not fear, but something like pity. "Don't listen," he said simply. "Don't listen to what?" she asked. He turned his gaze back to the radio, adjusting the dial, though there was no sound. "If you hear voices," he said after a pause, "they're not meant for you." Before she could ask more, he stood and left the room. The clock struck midnight. The building seemed to shift, like the air itself had grown heavier. Yuki returned to the weaving floor. The moment she stepped in, she noticed it, the smell, faint but distinct. A mixture of burnt fabric and old ash. It seemed to seep from the walls. She checked the machines one by one, running her hand across the cold metal frames. Everything looked normal. But when she reached line 3, the one that had turned on by itself the night before, she froze. The machine's control panel flickered. A single red light blinked slowly, like a heartbeat. The power switch was clearly off. She leaned closer, squinting to read the indicator label. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened surface, and behind it, for just a second, she saw another face. It was faint, translucent, hovering over her shoulder. A woman's face, pale and expressionless, with strands of long, black hair falling forward like a curtain. The mouth was moving, whispering something Yuki couldn't hear. Her breath caught in her throat. She spun around, shining her flashlight through the haze. The beam passed over the looms, the empty aisles, the hanging sheets of dust-covered fabric, nothing, just silence. She forced a shaky laugh. "Lack of sleep," she whispered to herself. "That's all it is." But then came the sound, faint, rhythmic. Tap, 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 like a footstep, or maybe something hitting the wooden floor. It came from the far end of the room, near the older, unused looms. Yuki hesitated. Every instinct told her to turn around, to go back to the office and call Tanaka. But curiosity, or something deeper, pulled her forward. The air grew colder as she moved down the aisle, the smell of smoke thickening. Her flashlight flickered once, twice. The beam dimmed, but she kept going. When she reached the final row of looms, she saw it again. Movement. One of the old weaving machines was rocking slightly, its threads trembling as if touched by invisible hands. The air vibrated faintly, carrying a low hum, almost like a tune. Yuki stepped closer. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her ears. Then she heard it. A whisper, soft, female, and layered with others. Dozens of voices, overlapping, weaving together into something that wasn't quite language, but felt deliberate, purposeful. It was coming from the machines. She staggered back, clapping her hands over her ears. But the sound didn't stop. It wasn't coming through her ears anymore. It was inside her head. For a split second, she thought she understood one word, stretched and distant, work, and then it was gone. The lights buzzed faintly. The air returned to stillness, and the looms stood motionless again. Yuki ran back to the office, her pulse racing. Tanaka wasn't there. The heater had shut off, and his radio was just static. On the table sat his security logbook, open to a blank page. In the reflection of the office window, she thought she saw movement behind her pale outlines, shifting in the dark. But when she turned, the hallway was empty. The factory was silent again. But Yuki knew, without a doubt, she hadn't been alone out there. Something was trying to reach her. Or perhaps it had already noticed her. The following evening, the rain came down in steady sheets, turning the roads into rivers of reflection. Yuki hesitated at the gate, gripping her umbrella tightly. She almost turned back, but quitting wasn't an option. Rent was due, and this job, strange as it was, paid on time. She told herself it would be fine if she stayed near the lit areas, avoided the older sections, and ignored anything unusual. But as soon as she stepped inside, she knew the factory wasn't the same. The moment she clocked in, the air felt different, dense, charged. The fluorescent lights above buzzed louder than usual, casting faint halos across the damp floor. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the space had grown larger overnight. The faint smell of burnt fabric had returned, stronger now, almost sweet. Tanaka was waiting near the entrance, his uniform darker than usual from the rain. He didn't greet her. Instead, he stared past her toward the corridor that led to the proster, weaving floor. His face looked drained of color. "Don't go near line 3 tonight," he said quietly. Yuki frowned. "Why? Did something happen?" He hesitated. His eyes flickered toward the dark hallway. "Just don't." Then he walked away, disappearing into the shadows before she could ask more. By 10:30, the factory was silent, except for the occasional groan of shifting pipes. Yuki tried to focus on her logs, but her mind kept replaying Tanaka's warning. What did he mean? Why line 3 again? She had almost convinced herself it was just his superstition when she heard a faint thud followed by a dragging sound. It came from the direction of the storage wing, an area marked "Do Not Enter." That section had been sealed for years after part of the ceiling collapsed, but now, through the gloom, she saw a dim light flickering beneath the door. She approached slowly. The old wooden door trembled slightly, as though something pressed against it from the other side. Then, without warning, the handle moved a slow, deliberate turn. Her flashlight beam shook as she aimed it toward the gap. "Is someone there?" she called out. No answer, only the sound of dripping water somewhere inside. She stepped back. The handle stilled. The door stopped moving. Then she saw a black thread slipping slowly through the crack, trailing across the floor toward her boot. It looked like sewing thread, thick and damp, pulsing faintly as though alive. She stumbled back, and the thread recoiled, vanishing beneath the door. Yuki turned and ran, her footsteps echoing through the corridors. She didn't stop until she reached the main office. Her hands shook as she tried to breathe. When she looked up, someone was standing at the far end of the hallway, a woman in a gray factory uniform, head bowed, long hair hanging over her face. The fabric of her uniform looked wet, almost burned around the edges. "Hey!" Yuki started, but the woman raised her head slightly. Her mouth moved as if speaking, but no sound came out. Then, slowly, she lifted one trembling hand and pointed toward the main floor. The gesture was unmistakable, a warning. But when Yuki blinked, the woman was gone. Heart pounding, she made her way back to the weaving floor. The factory clock showed a few minutes past midnight. The moment she crossed the threshold, she noticed something different. All of the looms, every single one, had turned to face the same direction. Their wheels, threads, and needles had aligned perfectly, pointing toward line 3. She froze. The air vibrated with faint, synchronized movement. The machines were off, yet they creaked softly, threads swaying as if brushed by invisible fingers. Then came the sound again, the whispering. But this time, it was louder, clearer. She could make out the cadence of speech, dozens of voices murmuring in unison. She covered her ears, but one voice rose above the rest, close and distinct, like someone whispering right beside her ear. "Don't stay after the bell." Her flashlight flickered, and in that strobe of dim light she saw movement, pale shapes sitting at the looms, faces half hidden in shadow. Their hands moved in perfect rhythm, weaving threads that shimmered faintly before fading into air. And then the factory bell rang. The sharp, metallic clang echoed through the halls, though the bell hadn't worked in years. The figures froze mid-motion. The whispering stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. Yuki backed away, her breath coming fast. The sound of footsteps echoed somewhere behind her, quick, uneven, almost frantic. She spun around, expecting to see Tanaka. Instead, she saw Okada, the day shift supervisor, standing halfway down the aisle, his face pale, eyes wide. "What are you doing here?" Yuki asked, her voice trembling. "I could ask you the same," he replied. His tone was sharp, panicked. "Didn't Tanaka tell you to stay? Away?" "He did," she said. "But why?" Okada hesitated, his gaze darting toward the silent machines. "Because they're not machines anymore." Before Yuki could respond, a faint clicking sound filled the air, the sound of hundreds of needles moving in perfect unison. The looms began to tremble again, their threads twisting into unfamiliar patterns. The whispering returned, louder, desperate. Okada grabbed her arm. "We need to go. Now." But Yuki couldn't move. Her eyes were fixed on one of the figures at the far end of the room. It was staring back at her, a woman with hollow eyes and lips sewn tightly with black thread. The lights flickered once more, and when they steadied, the woman was gone. Only the looms remained, their threads swaying gently, as if the air itself was breathing. And somewhere deep in the factory, beyond the walls and the rust, the whispering continued, weaving itself into the rhythm of the night. Okada's grip tightened on Yuki's arm as he pulled her toward the exit, his flashlight shaking in his other hand. The sound of the looms clattering in unison filled the factory, echoing through the rafters like the beating of 100 metallic hearts. The whispering had returned louder now, more human, almost pleading. Yuki stumbled beside him, trying to keep pace. "What's happening?" she shouted over the mechanical hum. "They wake when someone listens," Okada said breathlessly. That's what the old workers used to say. They said the voices were the women who never left. They reached the end of the corridor, but the main doors were sealed shut. Okada cursed under his breath, fumbling with the lock. His hands trembled. "The power's cut." The security system must have triggered. Behind them, the lights flickered, and the whispers shifted into something that almost resembled words, faint phrases looping endlessly, like a broken recording. Work, work, finish, finish. Yuki turned. Back. The rows of looms had begun to move again, their wooden frames creaking, threads tightening, needles clicking with a rhythm that mimicked breathing. Shadows flickered across the walls, silhouettes of figures hunched over their stations, hands weaving, heads bowed, and then she saw her. At the far end of the floor stood the woman with the sewn mouth. Her skin was pale gray, stretched thin across her face, and her eyes were deep, hollow voids that seemed to absorb the light. The black threads that stitched her lips together were frayed and damp, moving slightly as if something beneath was still trying to speak. Yuki froze. The woman raised her hands slowly, the gesture precise, deliberate. She pointed toward the ceiling, then toward Yuki. The meaning wasn't clear, but the warning in her stare was unmistakable. "Okada," Yuki whispered. "She's looking at me." He turned, saw nothing, and shook his head. "Don't look at them. Don't acknowledge them." But Yuki couldn't help it. Her gaze was locked. For a heartbeat, everything around her, the noise, the flickering lights, even Okada's voice seemed to fade into silence. The woman's expression softened, almost mournful. Then, the air around her shimmered, and Yuki saw something aflash, like a memory not her own. The same factory, decades earlier. Rows of women working tirelessly at the looms. The air thick with heat and lint, the smell of sweat and burning oil. A bell rings, distant shouting, then fire. The screams echoed through her mind, sharp and vivid. The building collapsing, the women trapped inside. Yuki gasped and stumbled backward, breaking the connection. The vision vanished, replaced by the cold, empty factory. "What did you see?" Okada asked, his voice trembling. "They were burning," Yuki whispered. "They never left." He said nothing, only pressed a trembling hand to his forehead. "It happened in 1944, he muttered. "A fire during the war. They were sewing uniforms for the army. The exits were chained. No one made it out." The whispering swelled again, rising into a low wail that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Yuki covered her ears, but it did nothing. The sound wasn't external, it was inside her head, vibrating in her bones. Then, all at once, the machine stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. The woman with the sewn mouth was now standing only a few feet away. Her presence brought with it an unbearable cold. Yuki's breath turned to mist. The ghost's lips began to move beneath the threads, straining against the black stitches. Her eyes locked onto Yuki's, desperate. Yuki took a step forward, despite the terror clawing at her chest. "What do you want?" she whispered. The woman's hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers hovering just above Yuki's arm. And then Yuki heard it faint, muffled, but unmistakable, a voice whispering from behind the stitches. "Help! Us!" The lights exploded in a flash. The looms began to spin violently, threads snapping and flying like lashes. The sound of chains echoed through the hall, metal scraping against metal. Yuki screamed and ducked as a wooden beam crashed beside her, splintering the floor. Okada grabbed her arm again, pulling her toward the emergency stairs. "We have to go!" They ran up the narrow steps to the observation level. From above, they could see the entire factory floor, and the sight made Yuki's blood run cold. The looms were moving on their own, their threads weaving shapes that looked like faces distorted, stretched expressions of agony. Each machine seemed to hold a figure, faintly visible through the smoke, the outlines of women still working, still repeating their final task. "They're trapped," Yuki whispered. Okada shook his head. "No, they're repeating. Forever." Down below, the woman with the sewn mouth turned her gaze upward toward the observation deck. Her head tilted, slow and deliberate. She raised one hand again and made a single motion, running her finger across her throat. The fire alarms blared. Red lights flashed across the ceiling. Somewhere in the distance, Yuki smelled smoke. Real smoke. Okada shouted something, but she couldn't hear him over the sirens. The sprinkler system kicked in, spraying mist across the factory. But instead of extinguishing, the smoke thickened, dark and oily. The whispering returned, screaming now, the sound of hundreds of voices crying in unison. And through it all, the same word echoed clearly, over and over: "Stay." Yuki fell to her knees, clutching her head. The walls trembled, the machines shuddered violently, and the floor below began to buckle under the strain. The building itself seemed alive, breathing, groaning, mourning. And then, just before everything went black, Yuki saw the woman one last time standing in the center of the floor, her stitches breaking open, black threads spilling out like smoke. Her mouth stretched wide in a soundless scream. The last thing Yuki heard before losing consciousness was the whisper of the looms working, weaving, whispering her name. When Yuki opened her eyes, everything was quiet. The air was thick with the smell of soot and damp iron. She was lying on the cold concrete floor of the observation deck, her head throbbing. The factory was shrouded in a dense haze, a gray curtain that blurred the outlines of the looms below. For a moment, she thought it had all been a nightmare. The whispers, the ghosts, the fire, maybe her mind had broken under exhaustion. Then she heard the faint hum again, the same rhythm she had heard every night since she started. The slow, steady sound of weaving. Click, sh, click, sh. Yuki sat up, coughing. The sprinklers had stopped, but the water still dripped from the ceiling in slow, uneven intervals. The emergency lights flickered red across the soaked floor, reflecting like veins of blood through the mist. "Okada," she called out. Her voice sounded small, swallowed by the emptiness. No answer, only the sound of fabric tightening. She forced herself to stand, using the railing for balance. Her clothes were damp, her hair clinging to her face. She looked down at the factory floor, and her breath caught in her throat. The looms had stopped. Every machine stood still, but seated before them were figures faint, translucent, glowing faintly like the last embers of a dying fire. Dozens of women, all in identical factory uniforms, their heads bowed, their hands still moving in ghostly repetition. Threads moved between their fingers, forming patterns that vanished as soon as they took shape. And at the center of them all stood the woman with the sewn mouth. Yuki's heart pounded. She could see her more clearly now, her face illuminated by the flicker of the warning lights. The stitches that sealed her lips were torn open, hanging loose across her chin like dead vines. Her mouth moved freely now, but the sound that came out wasn't a scream. It was a whisper, hundreds of whispers layered into one, overlapping and continuous, like wind through broken glass. Yuki pressed her hands over her ears, but she could still hear it. The voice was inside her, reaching through the static of thought. They left us. They sealed the doors. We burned. Images began to flash behind her eyes, the factory decades ago, alive and crowded. The machines roaring. Women working in endless rows. The supervisors shouting above the noise. Then the alarms, the smoke, the locked exits. Flames rising through the ceiling, devouring the air. The screams were unbearable. Yuki staggered back, gripping the railing. "It was real," she whispered. "The fire. It really happened here." The ghost looked up at her. "We never stopped." Yuki blinked. "What do you mean?" The woman raised a trembling hand, pointing at the machines. "They built over us. They used our ashes to strengthen the walls. The floor remembers." And in that moment, Yuki understood. The factory had never been rebuilt. It had been resumed. The same building, the same looms, the same air thick with unspoken memory. Every vibration, every whisper, every movement was part of the echo left behind by the trapped souls. They weren't haunting the factory, they were the factory. She turned toward the stairwell, desperate to find Okada, to leave, to breathe air that wasn't heavy with death. But as she moved, something crunched under her boot. She looked down and froze. A small, rusted nameplate lay half buried in the dust. The engraving was worn, but still legible. Y. Takahashi. Her breath caught. Takahashi. Her grandmother's maiden name. She crouched down, brushing away the dirt, her hands shaking. The plate had once been attached to a uniform tag, the kind worn by workers during the war. And beneath it, faintly etched into the concrete, were burn marks, the shape of small hands pressed into the floor. Yuki's vision blurred. "No," she whispered. "That can't be." But deep inside she knew. Her grandmother had worked in Aichi during the war. Yuki had grown up hearing fragments of her stories, the exhaustion, the factory heat, the way her friend disappeared after an explosion. She had never said where it happened. Now Yuki knew. The woman with the sewn mouth stepped closer, her form shimmering. Her hollow eyes softened for the first time. "You're her blood," the voice whispered. "You came back." Tears blurred Yuki's sight. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know what they did to you." The woman's gaze lingered, then shifted toward the doorway. "Go before it begins again." The hum grew louder. The looms began to tremble, wheels spinning without power. The sound built into a deafening chorus, thousands of threads tightening at once. The floor beneath Yuki vibrated as if the building itself was breathing again. She turned to run, but the stairwell was no longer there. The path had folded into darkness, swallowed by the haze. The walls rippled like fabric. "Please," she whispered, "I want to leave." The ghost stepped forward, extending a pale, flickering hand. For a moment, Yuki hesitated, but then she reached out. Their hands met, and an unbearable wave of cold rushed through her body. The whispers fell silent. In that instant, Yuki saw everything. The night of the fire, the women pounding on the doors that wouldn't open, the overseers fleeing first, the flames swallowing the room. The final moments when they gathered at their looms, trying to finish their last task before the ceiling collapsed. Their voices merged into one, not screaming, but whispering. Whispering prayers, names, apologies. Whispering work because that was all they had left. When Yuki gasped for air, she was standing outside. The factory loomed behind her, dark and motionless, the rain falling hard against her face. The windows were dark again. No light, no movement. Tanaka's old security booth stood empty by the gate. Her hands were trembling. She looked down, and her palm was the rusted nameplate, the letters faint but still visible. For the first time since she started working there, the factory was silent. Completely silent. But as she turned to leave, a faint sound followed a single thread snapping in the wind. Then another, and faintly, beneath the rain, came the smallest whisper, "Finish it." Yuki dropped the nameplate and ran, never once looking back. Days later, the factory burned. No one knew how the fire started. The police report called it an electrical malfunction, though the power had been cut for weeks. By the time the flames were contained, the entire structure had collapsed inward, reduced to a blackened skeleton of steel and ash. No one was inside. No one alive, at least. Yuki watched the news from her small apartment, her hands trembling as the footage replayed the same factory gate, the same roofline, now engulfed in fire just like the visions she'd seen. Reporters called it an accident. Locals didn't believe it. Some said it was the spirits finally freeing themselves. Others said the factory had taken back what belonged to it. That night, Yuki couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the woman's face, the loosened stitches, the hollow eyes. The whisper echoed faintly in her ear, as though woven into her breath. "Finish it." She turned on the light, her heart pounding. On the table lay the rusted nameplate she thought she'd dropped outside the factory. It was wet, as if it had been pulled from water. Beneath it, faint black threads had appeared thin, damp strands forming the outline of a fabric pattern. Yuki stared at it, frozen. The threads moved slightly, twisting into shapes she almost recognized, the same textile her grandmother used to sew, the same pattern from the uniforms of 1944. She reached out with shaking fingers. The thread twitched beneath her touch, coiling around her hand like something alive. Her phone buzzed suddenly, breaking the silence. It was a message from an unknown number. No text, just an audio file. She pressed play. Through the static came the sound of the looms click, shh, click, shh, and beneath it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "We're still working." Yuki dropped the phone. The sound didn't stop. It was coming from somewhere closer, the walls, the floor, the air around her. And as the lights flickered once more, a faint smell of burnt fabric filled the room. The story of the Factory of Whispers is only one of many places in Japan where the dead refuse to rest. Factories, schools, even hospitals all carry echoes of what was lost and never laid to peace. And while Yuki's encounter ended in silence, others have not been so lucky. Our next story takes us deeper into the mountains of Nagano, where a small rural hospital stands alone on the edge of the forest. At night, its empty corridors hum with the faint sound of rolling gurneys and distant cries no one should still be hearing. It's a story about a man who worked there, a man who cleaned after midnight, and discovered that some patients never truly leave. Takeshi Sato had never been afraid of hospitals. He'd worked in them for years, first as a maintenance worker, then as a janitor. To him, the smell of disinfectant, the echo of footsteps down sterile halls, even the steady beep of distant machines were all familiar. almost comforting. But the hospital outside Nagano was different. From the moment he arrived, something in the air felt wrong, too still, too heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He took the job because it paid extra for night shifts, and his family needed the money. His wife had just given birth to their second child, and the bills were stacking up. The hospital's manager, an aging man with a limp, warned him about the condition of the building. "It's old," he said, "and the third floor's been closed off for years. You'll only need to clean the lower wards and the surgical corridor. Stay out of the restricted area, and you'll be fine." Takeshi nodded, though the phrasing lingered in his mind. Stay out of the restricted area. He didn't ask why. His first few nights went by without incident. He'd clock in at 10, sweep the lobby, empty bins in the nurses' station, and mop the surgical wing. The air was always dry, faintly metallic, and the lights buzzed with a weak hum that filled the silence. But it was the emptiness that unsettled him most. After visiting hours, the entire building went dead. Quiet, no footsteps, no voices, just the distant hum of electricity. Even the sound of his mop against the tiles seemed too loud. The surgical ward was the hardest part. It stretched down a long corridor lined with glass observation rooms. Most of them were empty, but room 304 always caught his eye. The door was marked with a faded red sticker that read, "Restricted, do not enter." Through the glass panel, he could see an old operating table covered with a sheet, its metal legs stained with rust. The lights inside never worked, and every time he passed it, he swore he felt a faint drop in temperature just enough to make his skin prickle. One evening, while taking a short break by the vending machines, he overheard two nurses whispering in the staff lounge. "They shouldn't send anyone up there after midnight," one said. "Not after what happened," the other nurse shushed her. "Don't talk about that in front of the new hires." Takeshi pretended not to listen, but their words clung to him for the rest of the night. What happened? The answer came indirectly a few days later when he found an old newspaper clipping taped to the back of a storage door. The headline was half faded, but the words were clear enough to read, "Gas explosion kills. 12 in Nagano Hospital surgical ward destroyed." The date was from the late 1970 seconds. His stomach turned cold. The article mentioned a malfunction during a night operation, a sudden burst of flame that consumed the entire surgical floor. Staff members were trapped. Patients burned before rescue crews arrived. The details were gruesome, and the photo below the text showed a familiar hallway, the same corridor Takeshi now cleaned every night. He tried to shake it off. Ghost stories spread in every hospital. It was probably just coincidence, he told himself. Buildings this old always carried scars. But the more he tried to ignore it, the more he noticed little things. A faint smell of burnt antiseptic that lingered even after mopping. The way the air conditioner shut off for no reason around midnight. The subtle squeak of a gurney wheel echoing down the corridor, though he worked alone. Sometimes, when he looked into the reflective tiles, he thought he saw shapes moving behind him, the glimmer of someone in a patient gown, a flash of white where no one stood. And every time he reached room 304, he could swear he heard something faint from within. Not voices exactly, just a low, dragging sound, like metal scraping tile. He started wearing earbuds, pretending the music drowned it out, but even then, the faint noise crept through, steady and patient. By his fifth night, Takeshi was starting to dread his shift. The silence had changed. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was waiting. Takeshi arrived for his sixth night shift beneath a sky heavy with rain. The narrow road leading up to the hospital glistened under the dim headlights of his scooter, reflecting the flicker of lightning far in the distance. He parked beside the maintenance shed, killed the engine, and sat for a moment, staring at the dark outline of the building. Only a few windows glowed with weak yellow light. Everything else was swallowed by shadow. Inside, the air was colder than usual. His breath fogged faintly as he signed in at the reception desk. The night nurse, a woman in her 50s named Akiyama, gave him a polite nod but didn't speak. Her eyes were fixed on the window behind him, as if she was listening for something outside. "Quiet tonight?" Takeshi asked, trying to make small talk. She hesitated, then nodded. "Quieter than it should be," she said softly. "If the power flickers, don't panic. It happens sometimes." Takeshi gave a nervous laugh. "Old wiring, huh?" But Akiyama didn't answer. She turned and walked away, her footsteps fading into the distance. By 11, Takeshi was alone in the surgical ward again. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the mop in his hands moved in steady rhythm across the floor. Everything felt normal enough until the elevator at the end of the hall dinged softly. He froze. The elevator hadn't worked for months. The doors slid open with a groan, revealing an empty compartment. A draft of icy air rolled out, chilling his skin. He stepped closer, shining his flashlight inside. The buttons were dark, the floor glistening with what looked like water-small puddles that trailed outward, across the tiles, leading toward room 304. He stared at them, his pulse quickening. It looked like someone had walked through there barefoot. Wet footprints, faint but unmistakable. "Is anyone here?" he called. His voice sounded small in the long corridor. No reply, only the soft, dripping sound of water. He followed the footprints cautiously, his mop handle clutched tight like a weapon. The trail stopped in front of room 304. The door was slightly ajar. He was sure he'd locked it earlier. The air around him grew still, unnaturally still. Even the buzzing of the lights seemed to fade. Takeshi reached out with a trembling hand and pushed the door open wider. The beam of his flashlight sliced through the dark. Inside, the room was as it always was, abandoned, untouched. The operating table stood in the center, covered by a stained sheet. The smell hit him first, a damp, chemical odor mixed with something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. He stepped inside. The temperature dropped instantly. His breath came out in small clouds. The walls were lined with metal shelves filled with old surgical tools, scalpels, clamps, and glass jars sealed with tape. Some of them still held cloudy liquid in dark shapes that floated within. He swept the light across the floor. That's when he noticed the stain beneath the operating table. It wasn't just dark. It was wet, fresh. His throat tightened. "Hello?" The sound that came next made him freeze, a low scraping noise, like metal dragging against tile. It came from under the table. He crouched slightly, the flashlight shaking in his hand. "Is someone under there?" No answer. The scraping stopped. Then a soft whisper. He couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely a voice, fragile, female, and close. He leaned down just enough to see beneath the table. A pale hand shot out from the darkness, slamming against the floor. Takeshi stumbled back, his flashlight flickering wildly. The hand gripped the edge of the table, followed by an arm, and then she crawled out. The woman's hospital gown clung to her thin frame, soaked and blackened at the edges. Her hair hung in clumps over her face, dripping water onto the floor. Her skin was grayish, blistered in places, and her limbs moved at impossible angles, each joint bending too far. Takeshi backed against the wall, his voice breaking. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" The woman lifted her head slowly. Her eyes were gone, hollow sockets staring through him. Her mouth opened in a ragged whisper. "It's not over yet." Takeshi bolted for the door. The handle wouldn't turn. He yanked it harder, but it was locked from the outside. The woman's crawling grew louder behind him, the sound of wet limbs dragging across tile. He kicked the door, shouting for help, but his voice was swallowed by the corridor's silence. He turned and shone the light again, but she was gone. The room was empty. For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it. His mind raced, heart hammering. He backed toward the door again, gripping the handle, and then he felt it. A cold breath against his neck. He spun around. Nothing, just the flickering emergency light. Then, faintly, from inside the hallway, came the sound of wheels, a gurney rolling slowly toward him. Metal against tile. Screech, screech, screech. The air filled with the faint smell of smoke, sharp and acidic. Takeshi stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering. Through the small glass window in the door, he saw shadows moving in the corridor, silhouettes of figures in hospital gowns, standing still, heads tilted. He blinked. The figures were gone. The corridor stood empty again. The gurney sound faded. Takeshi unlocked the door without remembering how, his hands numb and shaking. He stumbled out into the hall, breathing hard, the mop long forgotten. The floor behind him glistened with new footprints, small, wet, and heading in every direction, as if something unseen had followed him out. From somewhere deep in the hospital, faint and echoing, came a single metallic clang, the sound of a surgical tray hitting the floor. He didn't go back to room 304 that night, but he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been under that table wasn't finished with him yet. The following night, Takeshi considered calling in sick. He told himself it was ridiculous grown men didn't get scared by empty rooms and strange noises. But the memory of that crawling woman lingered in his mind like a wound that wouldn't close. The way her limbs twisted, the hollow sockets, that whisper, "It's not over yet." He arrived at the hospital just before 10. The rain had stopped, leaving the world unnaturally quiet. The building loomed like a patient holding its breath. The guard at the entrance barely looked up as Takeshi signed in, his eyes fixed on the small security monitor beside him. Takeshi hesitated. Did the cameras catch anything last night? The guard blinked slowly. Footage corrupt, he muttered. The third floor always does that. Then he added something that sent a chill through Takeshi's stomach. If you hear her again, don't answer. Takeshi frowned. Her? The guard said nothing more, just turned back to the monitor. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered erratically. The air had a faint chemical scent, sharper than before. Takeshi grabbed his mop and bucket, forcing himself to stay calm. Every sound, the creak of a door hinge, the hum of an old vent, felt amplified. When he passed the nurse's station, Akiyama looked up from her paperwork. Her expression was tight, cautious. You shouldn't be here alone tonight, she said quietly. He forced a smile. Why? Did something happen again? She hesitated, then reached into her pocket and handed him a small charm wrapped in red thread. Someone left this on my desk this morning, she said. No note, just your name. He blinked. My name? She nodded. Old-style handwriting, like the kind you see on patient records from the 70s. Takeshi stared at the charm. The paper was yellowed, fragile. Inside the folds, he thought he saw faint black characters, his own name written carefully in ink. His heart thudded. Keep it on you, Akiyama said, and whatever happens, don't go back into 304. Her tone left no room for argument. He slipped the charm into his pocket and continued his rounds. But halfway down the surgical corridor, the lights went out. Total darkness swallowed the hall. Takeshi froze. The silence pressed against his ears, heavy and suffocating. He fumbled for his flashlight, flicking it on. The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating the polished floor and the wet footprints leading ahead. They weren't from shoes, bare feet. Small, delicate, trailing toward the end of the hallway. He followed slowly, each step echoing. The footprints glistened as if freshly made. When he reached the final door, room 304, the handle moved, not violently, but slowly, as though someone inside was testing it. Takeshi's throat tightened. "Hello?" No answer. Then, from behind the door, came a faint metallic, scraping the sound of something being dragged across the floor. He took a step back. "Who's in there?" Silence. Then a single knock. Not on the door, but from beneath the floorboards. He stumbled backward, bumping into a gurney that rolled slightly on its wheels. A faint voice drifted from the far end of the corridor, soft, cracked, but familiar. "It's not over yet." Takeshi spun around, shining the flashlight toward the sound. A figure stood at the intersection ahead, a nurse wearing an old uniform no one had used in decades. Her head was bent forward, hair obscuring her face. He called out, "Miss, are you—" She lifted her head. Her mouth was gone. Smooth, pale skin stretched where her lips should have been. The flashlight flickered violently, and for an instant she was right in front of him, whispering without sound. Takeshi stumbled back, heart slamming against his ribs. When the light steadied again, she was gone. The hallway looked normal. Too normal. He bolted toward the stairwell, desperate to leave, but stopped when he saw something written on the wall beside the door, faint letters smeared in what looked like soot. "Don't leave before the 4th." He had no idea what it meant. The 4th, what? Floor? Night? Hour? Then the hospital's power surged back on. The corridor lights flared to life, blinding him for a second. When his vision cleared, the message was gone. Takeshi's radio crackled suddenly, making him jump. It was Akiyama's voice, faint and static-filled. "Takeshi, come to the staff lounge, now." He sprinted down the hall, bursting into the lounge. Akiyama stood by the window, pale and trembling. "You saw them too, didn't you?" she said. He hesitated. "Saw who?" Her hands shook as she handed him a photograph, black and white, old and creased. It showed a group of nurses standing beside a surgical bed. At the edge of the photo, he recognized the same twisted operating table from room 304, but it wasn't the table that made his blood run cold. Standing among the nurses was the same faceless woman. "She died in the explosion," Akiyama whispered. "The gas leak started in her ward. They say she was the one who noticed it first, but when she tried to warn the surgeon, he told her to stay quiet." Takeshi stared at the photo. The nurse's hand was resting on the shoulder of a patient, a young man whose name tag read Sato. His breath hitched. That was his surname. Akiyama met his gaze. "Maybe you were meant to come here," she said. "Maybe it's not over yet." Before Takeshi could reply, the power flickered again. Somewhere above them, the emergency alarm began to wail. And through the static of the intercom system, a single sentence whispered through the halls. "Code Blue, room 304. The alarm echoed through the hospital, shrill and distorted, bouncing down the empty corridors like a warning from somewhere beyond the walls. "Code Blue, room 304. The voice on the intercom wasn't one Takeshi recognized. It was slow, distant, almost metallic, as if coming from a broken speaker deep inside the building. Akiyama froze. "There's no one in that room," she whispered. Before Takeshi could respond, the lights dimmed again, flickering in and out until only the red glow of the emergency exit signs remained. The air grew thick, humid and cold at the same time, carrying the faint smell of burnt antiseptic and something sharper like singed hair. Takeshi gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Maybe it's a malfunction, he said, though his voice cracked halfway through. The system's old. The intercom buzzed again, cutting him off. This time, the same voice spoke clearer, closer. Surgical team to room 304. Patient is waiting. Then the line went dead. Akiyama turned to him slowly. Don't go there. But the words barely reached him. Something compelled him, something heavy, magnetic, pulling him toward the third-floor corridor. He didn't understand it, but deep down, he knew he had to go. He grabbed his flashlight and started running. The sound of his footsteps echoed against the linoleum floor, each one louder than the last. As he reached the stairwell, the fluorescent lights above flickered and hummed, casting shifting shadows along the walls. The door to the third floor was open. It was never open. A gust of freezing air rushed past him, carrying the faint echo of metal clanging and distant voices murmuring. His flashlight trembled in his grip. The beam landed on the sign at the end of the hall, surgical ward, its letters cracked and faded. The corridor was filled with haze. Not smoke, not mist, something in between, like the air after a fire that refuses to die. The smell hit him instantly. Scorched fabric, burned plastic, and underneath it all, something rotten. He took a few steps forward, his shoes sticking slightly to the floor. Water? No. It was thicker than that a dark liquid streaked along the tiles, leading toward room 304. When he reached the door, it was already ajar. The inside glowed faintly red, as if lit by coals. Takeshi hesitated. Then he pushed the door open. The operating table stood in the center, illuminated by a single overhead light that flickered every few seconds. Instruments hung from rusted trays, some still dripping with a dark, oily substance. The air shimmered with heat, though his breath came out in clouds, and then movement. Shapes flickered around the room, barely visible in the haze. Figures in surgical masks and blood-stained gowns. They were working, or at least moving, as if they were their hands twitching in slow, jerky motions over an invisible body. The sound of metal instruments clinking filled the air, along with the faint, wet noise of cutting. Takeshi's pulse roared in his ears. "Stop," he whispered. "Please stop." None of them looked up. Their faces were blurred, their movements mechanical, looping, performing the same motions over and over again. And yet, beneath their masks, he could hear faint mumbling. Too late. Pressure falling. Keep working. It's not over yet. His flashlight wavered, and one of the surgeons froze mid-motion. Its head turned slowly toward him, the mask tearing open to reveal a mouth fused shut by melted flesh. It opened anyway, stretching, cracking, until a rasping voice escaped. "You're late." Takeshi stumbled backward, knocking over a tray. The instruments clattered to the ground, but the sound seemed distant, muffled, as if underwater. The light above him flickered out, then blazed back on. The room was empty. No surgeons, no equipment, just the old rusted operating table, and on it, a shape covered by a white sheet. Takeshi's breathing grew shallow. He didn't want to look, but something inside him pushed him forward. He reached out with trembling hands and lifted the edge of the sheet. He froze. Beneath it lay a charred body, blackened skin, twisted limbs, face unrecognizable. But the name tag pinned to the gown stopped his breath entirely. Sato T. His name. He dropped the sheet and stumbled back. No, that's not me," he muttered. "That's not—" The intercom buzzed again, louder now, filling the room with static. "Time of death. 12:04 a.m. The red light above the door flickered in rhythm with the voice. For a moment, Takeshi saw a reflection in the glass, his own face, but pale, hollow-eyed, streaked with ash. The whisper came again, closer than before, brushing against his ear. "You stayed too long." He turned sharply, and the woman from under the table stood there, her hair hung in wet ropes, her gown scorched and clinging to her frame. The sockets of her eyes glistened faintly, and her mouth moved soundlessly before the words reached him inside his head. "We can't leave until it's finished." Takeshi fell to his knees, his vision swimming. Around him, the room began to shift. The walls cracked, smoke seeping through. The floor rippled with firelight. The smell of burning returned in full force, choking and thick. He crawled toward the door, coughing, his hands slipping on the wet floor. But every time he looked up, the hallway changed, looping endlessly, back to room 304. The emergency lights flickered. His reflection in the glass grew darker, twisted not his face anymore, but hers. The burned woman's face, smiling through cracked lips, and then the intercom spoke one last time, in that same distant tone, calm and final. "All staff remain at your stations. The procedure is not complete," Takeshi screamed, but no sound came out. The world went white, like the flash of an explosion, frozen in time, and everything disappeared into silence. When Takeshi woke, the world was gray. The smell of smoke still lingered in his lungs. He was lying on a stretcher in the hospital lobby, drenched in sweat, his uniform streaked with soot and something darker. His vision swam as fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. Everything felt unreal, weightless, distant, as though he were seeing it through water. Akiyama stood nearby, speaking in a low voice to a paramedic. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. When she noticed Takeshi stir, she rushed to him. "You're awake," she said, kneeling beside him. "Thank God." He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. His voice came out cracked. "What happened?" She hesitated. "We found you by the entrance. You were unconscious. Your hair." She paused, her gaze flicking to his reflection in the glass doors. It turned gray. Takeshi reached up with a trembling hand. The strands that fell into view were silver white. His breath caught. "I don't remember leaving the room," he whispered. "I was in 304. There was fire." Akiyama's expression shifted pity, then fear. "Takeshi," she said softly. "There was no fire. The sprinklers didn't go off. The monitors didn't register a surge. You triggered the code blue yourself, but when security got there, that floor was empty. Completely empty." He stared at her, shaking his head. "No, I saw them. The surgeons. The woman. She spoke to me." Akiyama placed a trembling hand on his arm. "You shouldn't talk about her." "What do you mean?" "She's not a single spirit," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The fire didn't just kill patients. It killed the entire surgical staff. They were trapped inside during an operation. No one came to save them because the power went out. The intercom kept looping false updates, confusing the rescue team. By the time they reached the floor, everyone was dead. They said the bodies were fused to the equipment." Takeshi felt his chest tighten. "But I saw my name on the table, on the tag." Akiyama's hand froze. "Your name?" He nodded weakly. "Sato T. It was written on the patient gown. The body looked burned, like mine." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she stood and walked toward the nurse's station, pulling an old file from a cabinet. The folder was yellowed, edges brittle. She opened it carefully and handed it to him. "This is the original record from the 1978 explosion. One of the victims was a man named Toru Sato. He was undergoing emergency surgery for severe burns when the gas line ignited. He never left the table." Takeshi stared at the name. The room felt suddenly colder. "Sato," he murmured. That's my father's name. Akiyama's eyes widened. Your father? He nodded slowly. He died when I was a child. My mother never told me how. She just said it was an accident. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The faint hum of the lights seemed deafening. Then, quietly, Akiyama said, Maybe that's why you were drawn here. Takeshi felt dizzy. Images flashed behind his eyes, the operating table, the woman's whisper, the reflection that wasn't his own. He remembered the nurse without a mouth, the surgeons moving in endless loops, and the voice through the intercom. The procedure is not complete. It wasn't about me, he whispered. It was about him. He never finished the operation. Akiyama frowned. What do you mean? The patient. My father was still alive when the fire started. They were trying to save him. The surgeon refused to stop, even as the alarms went off. The nurse, the one I saw, she tried to warn them, but they ignored her. That's why she keeps saying it's not over. The realization hit him like a blow. The loop he witnessed wasn't random. It was their final moment, playing out over and over. The surgery frozen in time. The staff condemned to repeat it for eternity. The whispers, the sounds, the ghostly figures, all of it was their unfinished work. They never stopped, he said softly. They're still trying to save him. Akiyama stepped back, her face pale. And you? Takeshi looked at his trembling hands. I think I was supposed to help them finish it. The automatic doors slid open suddenly, and a cold gust swept through the lobby. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and smoke. The paramedic, who'd been standing nearby, turned toward the entrance, frowning. Did someone just come in? No one was there. The corridor beyond the glass was empty, but faint footprints began to appear on the polished floor, wet and dark, leading toward the elevators. Akiyama clutched her cross necklace. We need to leave, she whispered. Now. But Takeshi couldn't move. He was staring at the elevator panel. The light for the third floor had turned on by itself. The button glowed red, steady and unblinking. The paramedic crossed the room, muttering something about power glitches, and stepped into the elevator. The doors closed behind him with a dull chime. Seconds later, the lights in the lobby flickered. A faint hiss filled the air gas escaping somewhere deep below. The intercom crackled once more, the same distorted voice breaking through the static. Surgical team to room 304. Patient is waiting. Akiyama turned to Takeshi, her voice shaking. You hear it too? He nodded slowly. The elevator doors opened again. The paramedic was gone. The floor indicator still read 3. The scent of smoke returned, faint but growing. And for the first time, Takeshi thought he understood. The building wasn't haunted by the dead. The building was the operation still running, still waiting for completion. He looked at Akiyama, his expression hollow. It's starting again. Her hand tightened on his sleeve. Then we need to get out. But before she could finish, the lights went out, and somewhere above them, from the third floor, came the faint, rhythmic sound of metal dragging across tile. The power never came back on. Emergency lights pulsed dimly across the walls, flashing in long red intervals, like a heartbeat slowing down. Akiyama grabbed Takeshi's arm and pulled him toward the exit. The smell of gas was stronger now, sharp, suffocating, mixing with the faint scent of burning cloth. Somewhere above, the dragging sound grew louder, echoing down the stairwell. Don't look back, she whispered. Just move. They stumbled through the lobby toward the glass doors. Every few seconds, the intercom crackled to life, the same calm voice repeating, Surgical team to room 304. When they reached the doors, they didn't open. Takeshi slammed his shoulder against them once, twice, nothing. The emergency release switch sparked but didn't respond. The building was sealing itself again. Akiyama's flashlight flickered. Her face was pale, her eyes reflecting red light. "Takeshi, what if it's not done with you yet?" He turned slowly toward her, but before he could answer, a shadow passed behind the frosted glass, the outline of a woman in a patient gown, hair hanging low over her face. The figure pressed one hand to the glass, leaving a wet, dark imprint. Then came the whisper faint, carried through the air vents. "It's not over yet." A sudden metallic crash echoed through the hallway behind them. Takeshi spun around, and for a split second, the reflection in the glass changed not his face, but his father's, pale and burned, eyes wide with terror. The floor beneath them vibrated, and the lights flared white. The sound of a heartbeat filled the air, slow, deep, mechanical. The intercom's voice cut through the noise one last time. "Resuming procedure," Akiyama screamed, yanking him toward the emergency stairwell. The moment her hand touched the handle, the door swung open by itself. Beyond it, the stairwell was bathed in flickering orange light, and at the top of the stairs, silhouetted by fire, stood the surgical team, masks melted, instruments glinting in their hands. The last thing Takeshi saw was the lead surgeon raising a scalpel toward him, whispering through a mouth of charred flesh, "We've been waiting for you."